Joining me now is U.S. Representative French Hill. He is a Republican and he represents the 2nd District of Arkansas. He's running for re-election. We spoke with Joyce Elliott, your Democratic opponent, earlier. Thank you for participating in this Central Arkansas Real Estate Advocacy Forum. You've done this in years past, and we appreciate it.
You bet. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
We are going to obviously start with something not real estate related. So just to throw you in a curveball here.
Good.
I've asked this question before. I want to know how you have avoided shaking hands and kissing babies as you campaign for re-election in a COVID-19 pandemic. How has it changed campaigning in your mind?
Well, it's definitely changed campaigning because we're not going to have the state fairs that are so much fun to work a booth and to spend time with families. And it's been frustrating. I'm a hugger and happy to report that. And so there's a lot of air hugging and a lot of awkwardness around shaking hands or not shaking hands, and every business person in America is dealing with it. So we're no different. I did go back and read about the 1918 pandemic and the impact on the 1918 elections. And one thing they said, well, there are no torchlit marches, there's no picnics. So we're gonna do this, try this new thing. It's called direct mail. And so they canceled a lot of conventions that year and used mail and used newspaper advertising more, lists of people supporting their candidate. So they tried to, they lost that personal touch too.
I'm thinking that that's maybe how Charles Morgan and what eventually became Axiom maybe originated, was that direct mail there.
Yeah.
Well, good. Well, thank you for being with us. Let's begin with a question from the Arkansas Mortgage Bankers. This is fairly new news because President Trump just signed an executive order on the morning that we are sitting down to talk that will repeal the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. How do you see that impacting Arkansas, and do you support that repeal?
Well, I'm not sure what is the nature of that?
This is the rule that was an executive order signed by President Obama to mandate that communities have to put the plans.
Yeah, I am aware of that.
For housing.
So when the Fair Housing Acts were passed, there was an affirmative action to support fair housing on the part of the development community, cities, municipalities. And President Obama extended that in, a lot of people think, in a way that was too aggressive and too complicated and too expensive, where he would say that there could be some sort of indirect discrimination in fair housing based on locations of subdivisions and things of that nature. And so the Trump approach was to go back to the original wording and back to a more original approach. So I found it supportive. I haven't studied it and read it, but I'm generally familiar with it. And I think the Trump regulatory approach is really going back to the way things were before the Obama administration.
Let's take another issue that has been front and center in Congress. This comes from the Arkansas Land Title Association. A lot of debate between how much money in this, I think the HEROES Act is under consideration right now, to direct to state and local governments for aid. They've lost money from falling tax revenues because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Democrats and Republicans very separated on this. I'm assuming that you're in lockstep with Republican leadership in that there should not be a tremendous amount of money sent to state and local government aid, but tell me your position on that and why.
Well, we've sent almost $1 trillion to the states in different buckets. So a healthcare bucket, a housing related, education related. And we also sent $150 billion directly to the states for COVID relief. And the small states got $1.25 billion. Arkansas is one of those states. And when you look at that work, Treasury reported just last week to Congress that only 22% of that direct $150 billion, that direct funding to the states, has been allocated. And so it's Treasury's view that we ought to make sure we're spending the money that we have better first. And so, Roby, my position's been over the last couple of months, and talking to Governor Hutchinson about it, Larry Walther about it, let's give the states more flexibility with the $1.25 billion that they've gotten, including some of the flexibility for the other categories like education, and let's make sure they have access to that and that they can spend it beyond 12/31/2020. So that's what the Senate bill does. It gives them that flexibility, and they can spend it until 90 days after next year's fiscal year end. That would allow the governor perhaps to take on a broadband project with longer term consequences here. The Democrats have proposed about $1 trillion extra for states and cities, and that's just where the state of play is. And they've not countered that proposal yet, so we'll see what that final number is. Some states haven't spent any of the money. In fact, Alabama's legislature said, well, we might spend it, buy a new state capital with it. So the governors are have not really shared it with state and local governments. I think Governor Hutchinson's been pretty creative. You follow this closely. And he's allocated $150 million of the $1.25 billion for our counties and our cities. And that flexibility would let them spend that a lot better. So I think we ought to start with the accountability for the money we've already appropriated, the $3 trillion. But I'm open to see if there's a gap that we've missed, and that's what the Senate's debating right now.
All right, so kind of two tangent follow-ups on that.
Yep.
One, I'm hearing some frustration from you. Perhaps I'm reading too much between the lines, that you're not pleased with how all the money has been spent that has been allocated already from the federal government down to the state level. I'm not saying that's a criticism of Governor Hutchinson, but in general, that you're seeing the money is not being spent maybe in all the places that it could be.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think generally states have not spent it in the way that maybe Congress intended, that it would be really broad COVID relief for states, counties, and cities. Let me give you an example. We had to go to Secretary Mnuchin and have him issue some guidance to the states that they could use it for police, fire, and EMS overtime purposes. And he did that. But the governors were not using it to keep police and fire and EMS workers employed. And I think they should have been, particularly in the eye of, that's what it's for. If it's COVID related, if it's overtime, that's what it should have been used for. So I don't believe governors think they have all the flexibility that they would like. Secondly, look at district courts. We're trying to get district courts back open, getting certain public buildings back open at the state and local level. I mean, at the county and city level, and they don't have the resources. So I think I think we could have improved the writing of it. And so I think that's issue one. If there's some particular issue that needs to be increased, I'd be willing to look at that. But I'll tell you, this is so uneven around the country. Our sales tax revenues are up. Our income tax revenues are up in this state. We didn't completely shut down our economy. So they also need flexibility in how they propose to do that for some states that are in tougher straits than Arkansas.
I brought this up earlier, and this is my other tangent. Are you talking to mayors of cities in the district that are telling you that they are cash strapped for certain things, and that this additional money would be helpful? For instance, we reported earlier this week that Jonesboro sales tax collections out of the district, but they're up 3% year to date so far. Yet here in Little Rock, sales tax collections at the city level are down, particularly on restaurants and hotels. So are you hearing from local elected officials that we do need more money, and that money that's sitting at the state level is not going to be enough?
I'd say generally, yes. I cite Mayor Holland in Mayflower. Mayflower doesn't have a big retail base, as you know. It's a community between Conway and Little Rock. He wants to get the district court building reopened. He needs the funds to do that. Sales tax revenues are up in Faulkner County and Saline County, so they're doing pretty well. But then you look at C6 organizations and travel and marketing organizations that were not eligible for the Paycheck Protection Program. I believe the governor could create his own Paycheck Protection Program type element for those entities. And in the Senate bill, Senator McConnell's bill, Chuck Grassley has C6 organizations now eligible for PPP money, and he has the travel promotion organizations like Gretchen Hall's organization here in Little Rock would be eligible for assistance.
Okay. Let's move to another topic. This is from the Institute for Real Estate Management's Arkansas chapter. The moratorium on evictions resulting from COVID-19. Tenants can't pay their rent because they've lost their job. Landlords can't pay their mortgages because the tenants can't pay their rent, or they're pulling it out of their pocket, might
Yep.
be more where that's coming from.
Yep.
The moratorium can't go on forever. I mean, we can't continue to subsidize people at some sort of unemployment assistance or for whatever. It can't create something for this moratorium to
Right.
continue. What's the solution to you? 'Cause President Trump has put an executive action in order. I don't know what all it does. I'm curious your take on that. But what's the solution for ending that cycle?
Well, getting back to work is number one, and we've got 8 million more people working than we had in April. So we lost over 20 million jobs in March, and we've clawed back about 8 million of those jobs. So those people getting back to work is a huge help. But we still have 13 million people fewer working than in February. So we have, excuse me, we have a long way to go. In my view, the whole mix of what we did in the CARES Act was to address that, which was the individual economic impact payments for families, the unemployment compensation help for the states, the payment for medical care and quarantine expenses on family and medical leave if you were taken away. So there were a lot of issues to try to put resources to families to weather what the public health people told us was going to be a very short-term issue. And I think all these programs were designed around, this is going to be a short-term challenge, 90 days, 4 months, which is why you had the expiration issues here. So I believe that's a better way to go, is to continue to provide that kind of help than declare moratoriums. But with that said, you have still flexibility over on the mortgage side from FHA and from FHFA, working with Fannie and Freddie, to help work with servicers to offer payment plans to people with a home mortgage. That's different than a rent eviction, but it's the forbearance piece and the prohibition on evictions are all part of that effort to help families get through the virus. So I think on those renters, the Senate has some rental assistance money in their bill. The Democrats have some rental assistance type program in their bill, and it's just a matter of seeing where that goes. But ultimately, what's the best answer? Get people back to work and let them have also some support from the unemployment compensation system while they're in the process.
Well, you can't wave a magic wand and get everybody back to work overnight.
Yep. And that's why we have all those other support programs.
Take that same topic there and apply this towards what the Arkansas Apartment Association would be concerned about too, and that are renters of apartment and apartment complexes. Do you think that the solutions are in place to help them with the short-term and the long-term needs?
Well, our apartment landlords are concerned about broad mandates on no evictions, and I'm sure they're all working very hard with their tenants to try to get them through this process as well. I mean, our market economy has some give and take, and when a banker gives you 180 days P&I forbearance on your shopping center loan, the sort of intent was you might bother to help those tenants in the shopping center who don't have a PPP loan. So I think we're just going to have to work through it, and there's no one easy answer to it. But we're not going to be able to continue with moratoriums forever on evictions.
What do you think of the president's executive order on this action there? He signed something over this past weekend to that effect. I'll read you a little bit about what the order says. It directs the Department of Health and Human Services and the Centers for Disease Control to consider whether any measures temporarily halting residential evictions are necessary. It's pretty vague language.
Yeah, no, I know. Of course, I don't support broad executive orders from presidents, any president, Trump or Obama or any other president. I thought President Trump did try to very, very narrowly craft these executive orders very specifically, and this is a classic example of just how narrowly he crafted it, whether you're talking about, he did it in all of them. And that was, he's saying, well, if you have broad evictions in apartment complexes, aren't you putting public health at risk by taking people away from their home, taking away from their family, or putting them out potentially on the street, and doesn't that have public health consequences? So that's why he's attempted to make this a recommendation from the Health and Human Services Secretary and CDC that it's not in the public health interest to have broad evictions. I thought it was actually a pretty narrow crafting, since he has no authority over state law per se about evictions. And he did that in a similar way, whether it's talking about student loan repayment or the unemployment compensation idea. He attempted to draft it very narrowly. What's the whole point of that? Is that Speaker Pelosi has blocked a short-term extension of the $600 a week for unemployment compensation for the states, so that the Senate and House can reach agreement on all these other issues that Roby outlined. And President Trump basically said, look, I'm going to try to do what I can within the limited role I have, because this is essentially a legislative matter. And I think he called her bluff on it. And we'll see if it produces talks. I took it on Monday morning that both Speaker Pelosi and Steve Mnuchin had nice things to say to each other, so perhaps it might break the logjam.
There's a lot of bluffing going
There's
on
a lot
in
of bluffing
Washington,
going on,
D.C. This question comes from the North Pulaski Realtors Association. I believe the Arkansas Mortgage Bankers Association have some similar concerns too. This relates to the Jobs and Tax Cut Act of 2017, which you supported.
Yep.
Should there be a tax credit for homeowners that don't itemize their federal income taxes? You know how the system works right now. You got to either pick this larger standardized deduction, or you got to itemize. Is it in balance right now?
Well, I think based on looking at people who itemized and looking at their effective tax rates in Arkansas versus those who didn't, I think more Arkansas families benefited by taking the simpler approach of taking the standard deduction after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. A substantial portion of Arkansas filers had a lower rate and a simpler filing period by taking that standard deduction. That doesn't deal with everybody, though, depending on how much your mortgage is, and so I would just leave it at that. That when I look at the distribution tables in Arkansas, more families are benefited by that standard deduction.
Let me ask this question maybe in a little bit more theoretical way there. Are we doing enough to incentivize home ownership?
Well, there's really nothing more incentivized in America than home ownership, besides mortgage interest deductibility that was maintained in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It was not removed per se. And when you look at the mortgage industry, heavily subsidized by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and FHA, when you combine all that together, and FHA loans being sold to Ginnie Mae, and you look at the net cost to Americans on that, it's significant. It is a measurable amount of benefit in financing in that regard. And then you continue to have other benefits to household formation as well. So I don't think there's a segment of the economy that's probably got more long-term federal support than residential real estate. Including in multifamily, where Fannie Mae, where there's plenty of private sector lenders for apartment buildings. Fannie Mae is a substantial multifamily lender with the federal backstop. So I think there's quite a bit there, and it's produced a remarkable real estate-based economy in our country. It's produced an incredible opportunity to save and invest and create a home for a family for millions of Arkansas and American households. So I think it overall has been good. Where it's shifted from time to time in our history is when we say that everybody should have a home and everybody should have a home mortgage no matter their ability to repay. And that created a huge crisis in 05, 06, 07, and 08 that was a tremendous dislocation in our country. It's happened before. But we're able to have well over into the 60% range of families able to afford a home. And when you look at the affordability, it's never been more affordable now. Our 30-year rate of about $288 last week when I looked is the lowest since 1971. So housing affordability has never been better for the American couple and or anyone buying a property. So financing is available. It's the lowest since Richard Nixon was president, and I think the opportunities are strong there.
Let's move to another topic. We're going to get deep in the weeds on these next two, so bring all your acronyms and all your numbers with you. The Building Owners and Managers Association want to talk about the Corporate Transparency Act.
Yeah.
It's a broad bill, but obviously at its heart, it's about disclosure of business ownership in large part to avoid money laundering, something that I know you know quite a bit about. Yep. You voted against this when it came up for a vote. Tell me why and what's your philosophy on this?
Yeah, well, first of all, the bill is about disclosing beneficial owners of limited liability companies in all 50 states. And in America, we don't have one incorporation standard. We have 50 incorporation standards. And lots of small businesses choose a limited liability company as a pass-through way to start their business. And Carolyn Maloney of New York has been working on this effort for 10 years. She has the support of the big Wall Street banks who want to shift the burden of collecting beneficial ownership information in both the deposit and the lending aspect of commercial banking to the small business person and take the burden off the banks. And that's point one. Point two is we already collect this information. It's already required to collect this information. This is not a new requirement. The spin by Carolyn Maloney and the proponents of this bill is this is needed, this is not collected, this is not something we already do, and in point of fact, we do. And then thirdly, when there is concern about the real estate industry and straw buyers in Miami or New York who are Iranian terrorists who form a shell company in Delaware with the owners in Bermuda, and they buy a high-rise condo on Fifth Avenue.
This happens every day, doesn't it?
It does, according to Carolyn Maloney.
Right.
And I think it probably happens a lot. The Treasury Department, through the Anti-Money Laundering and Bank Secrecy Act team at FinCEN, they have sweep exams of every real estate transaction in Miami-Dade, New York, all the major metro areas exactly for this purpose. That even though a real estate transaction is not technically covered by a cash transaction sale, like you would if you went and bought a car for cash at $25,000, they do that sweep exam. So I believe that Carolyn Maloney's bill was not the right approach. I introduced many amendments to change it and make it the right approach, and the Democrats passed it anyway. And I believe it'll raise cost and will potentially make tens of thousands of small business people felons as it's currently drafted. And it's also, I don't believe the privacy aspects of it are fair either. Other than that, it's a great bill.
The Commercial Real Estate Council wants to know about 1031 tax deferred exchanges in the tax code there. It's a pretty highly specialized part of the tax code there towards real estate. Correct me if I'm wrong, this is basically allows for investment property to swap back and forth to some extent. Does this need to be revisited? Are you?
Well, it's the like-kind exchange rules, which we've had for many, many years. And I'd say there's one gravitational aspect of it is any business property type can be like-kind exchanged into agricultural property. Some people have had editorial comments about that over the years, that it's not quite a like-kind exchange. But I'm a supporter of 1031 exchanges. I think it's ultimately there will be a piper paid for that capital built up in that exchange when the property is ultimately sold. But I don't, and it was thoroughly debated in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and it was elected to basically leave it status quo. So I'm supportive of 1031 exchanges.
All right, the Arkansas Realtors Association has our last real estate question about the impact of force majeure related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you think there needs to be a new look or a new definition by Congress based on circumstances that might not have been thought through?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's gotten a lot of behind-the-scenes talk in Congress and a couple of things. First of all, you've seen Mitch McConnell, who's the Republican leader over in the Senate, proposing that there be liability protection for business, schools, nonprofits who use best efforts to comply with CDC standards and open up, right, so that they're not hit by frivolous lawsuits. That's a very important issue to him. And that's an issue about business interruption insurance and what actual contractual rights are under state law and force majeure. I would say that states ought to look at the force majeure definitions in their contracts, and that's something that realtors and real estate lawyers should consider doing prospectively, thinking about it. And I think there's a lot of prospective work now, including work involving Carolyn Maloney again, on should we have some sort of pandemic-oriented business interruption insurance. And I think we should consider it, excuse me, and talk about it, but not rush into it, because I think we ought to have hearings on it and talk about what that means. When you pay, you pretty much have earthquake covered now in policies, and people tell you might have cyber coverage. You really don't. You have money that pays for you to send out a notice that you were breached is what that policy covers. So that's not really cyber coverage. I don't want this to be watered down in the same way. Let's look at what business expenses are, what an approach to premiums might be to really give people some sort of pandemic coverage, or certainly if it's not a pandemic, it's a localized outbreak. So I think all this area ought to be looked at legally on the insurance side, business interruption side, the liability side, so that you can open business and get business back up and running. And then finally on the contractual side, which is, can I honor this contract, or is this pandemic triggering a force majeure clause, in some contract I have? So it's an important area, and we ought to learn from this example and find out what's in the best interest long run of our economy.
Sounds like you and Representative Maloney have dinner on a regular basis.
We see a lot of each other.
Yeah, I got that. All right.
Yeah, she just won her primary after votes being counted for 20 or 25 extra days.
I'll tell her to put you down for a contribution. How about that? So,
probably not likely.
Last question for you. What is the best political advice you have ever given or received?
Number one, be yourself. Be yourself. I think an important part of the political mission is to build relationships and let people see you for who you are. And so I think voters, citizens, customers, family members, everybody can spot a phony and somebody who's trying to be something they're not. And so I think be yourself is the best advice I'd give.
All right. Congressman French Hill, thank you for
You bet.
participating today.
Thank
We
you all
appreciate
very
you.
much.